In the last video we looked at an application that had lots of problems that I promised could be solved fairly elegantly using the observer pattern. And in this video we're going to implement that observer pattern in a way that is consistent with the actual design of the pattern. Okay, so let's clean things up a bit to start with. Let's go back into our application, and I'm going to take out a number of things. So first of all, I'm going to only keep at the form level the news feed itself. I shouldn't have to track all the instances of the forms that are running. That's actually something that C# does in the background, and it's not something we normally would want to do. So I'm going to remove those, and that's going to make it so that I need to actually declare the fact that this ticker form is a news ticker form. Type of variable, and I'm also going to have to declare the fact that this news list form is a news list type of variable. Okay, and I'm also going to remove all references here, because what I want to have happen is to have this add story call essentially take care of all of the notification processes. So I want this add story to notify any and all interested parties of the fact that we have a new news item that they might be interested in displaying. So I'm going to remove this and just simplify my form down to the bare minimums. Okay, so let's take a closer look at the news feed itself. Now, when the news feed receives a story, currently all it does is add that story to a list. Now what I would like to do is also have it notify observers, O-B-S-E-R-E-R-S, at the same time. Now in order to do that in a traditional form, I would need to have some means of keeping track of all of my observers, and all of those observers would in some way need to implement a method that I could call that would let me tell them that I had a new news story for them to process. Well, I'm going to handle that by creating an interface, and then I'm going to have all of my observers, in this case my observers are my two news display forms, I'm going to have those forms implement that interface. So let me create a new interface, add new item. I'm going to select interface up here, and we're going to use the standard naming convention here. It's going to be new news item. So that interface is going to implement one method. It's going to have a method that returns nothing, but essentially notifies whoever cares that I've received a new news story. In order to receive that story, I've actually got to pass that in as a parameter. So anybody who wants to be notified of the receipt of a new news story needs to implement this interface. Okay, so the things that I care about are my two forms. My two forms need to be able to implement this interface, and in order to do that I've got to declare them as implementing that interface, and then also implement a method with this signature that can then be called by my feed. So let's go into my news list form and modify it slightly so that it implements the new news item interface, and I need to implement my method I've got right here. Okay, so my method was receive news story, passes in the news story that is being received, and all I'm going to do with that story is turn around and add that news story to my list. Okay, I've got a method that does that, it adds it. Need to do the same thing over here to my news ticker form. So let me view the code. Let me paste my method in. Turns out that It's actually identical because I also have a method in this form called add new story that takes the very same story object as a parameter, and I've now satisfied the requirements for my iNewNewsItem interface. So I've got the ability now to say to my newsFeed class, hey, I'm interested. I'm a class that can conceivably be told about new news stories. But I don't have the ability right now within this newsFeed class to actually register listeners. Okay, I don't have any way to register with this class the fact that I want to receive stories. So in order to do that, I need to create a method that does that. So I'm going to have a public method called register listener, and it's going to take as a parameter a class, some class that cares about receiving that feed. So iNewNewsItem interested class, or interested rather object. Okay, so this is an object that implements the iNewNewsItem that is interested in receiving notifications. Now, when I register these, I have to expect that I can conceivably receive multiples. So what I want to do is I want to maintain a list of listeners. So in this case, my listeners will be kept in a list of type iNewNewsItem, and we'll call that one listeners, and we'll go ahead and initialize it. Okay, so I've got a list of listeners that presumably are going to be interested in hearing about the fact that I've received a new story. So in order to actually add that listener to the list, it's very little more than just coming down here and saying listeners.add interested object. Okay, that's the listener that cares about being added to the listeners. Okay, so I've got a list of objects, okay, in this case forms presumably, that are interested in receiving notifications of new stories. Now in order to actually notify them, I've got to call the method that I created. Okay, now I can't do that at once. I've actually got to loop through my list of listeners in order to do that. So I'm going to say for each, and each item in there is an iNewNewsItem instance. So for each listener in listeners, I want to call the method on listeners that allows them, listener, that allows them to receive a news story. So receive news story, and I'm going to pass in my news story. Okay. So at this point, this method gets called for every registered listener, and will in turn call the receive news story method on any of the interested parties. Okay, so I've basically got everything in place now. The only thing left to do is to actually register my interest in receiving that. Okay, I've got a method to register the listener, but I haven't actually called it yet. And the only way that I can do that is to have a reference to the instance of the feed that is providing that information. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to modify the constructor for a news ticker form so that it takes a feed. And then when I instantiate this form, it will be ready for me to actually register my interest in receiving new news items. So here I'm going to bring in a news feed as part of my constructor. And as soon as my form is constructed, I want to tell my news feed, or tell this news feed, that I'm actually interested in receiving notifications. So I'm going to register myself as a listener. I'm using the this keyword to say that this instance of the form, this new instance of the form, is the one that's interested in receiving notifications of new news items, new news stories. All right. I need to do exactly the same thing in my news list form as well. Okay, so I come back over here. I want to put in a parameter. And then I want to use that parameter to register my interest in receiving notifications. Okay. So the only other problem I've got now is I added this constructor parameter, and in my main form I haven't actually yet passed that parameter in. So anytime I create a new news ticker form or a new news list form, I've got to pass in an instance of a news feed, and it just so happens I have the one and only news feed instance that I care about sitting as a variable at the form level. So let's just pass that in so that the form can register its own interest in receiving new news feeds. Okay, so that's basically it. Now what should be happening is when I instantiate an instance of the form, I pass in the feed that I care about. Okay, so when I create a new news ticker form, I tell it which feed it's going to be receiving news from. The new news ticker form registers its interest with that feed to receive notifications. Okay, it passes a reference to itself. Itself happens to implement the interface that it needs in order for the news feed to in turn turn around and call that method to notify the fact that it should be receiving a new news story. Okay, so as soon as I register that listener, it adds it to my list of listeners, and whenever I receive a new story, I iterate through all of my listeners and call my receive news story method. So there are actually a couple of issues here that are going to cause this not to work properly. By default, for some reason, Visual Studio decides to not prefix its classes with public. So I need to do that in order for all of the classes to be able to understand or be able to see each other. And likewise, it does that with interfaces as well. So at this point, I want to see if this whole thing works. So let me run it. Let's move it into view here, and let's take a look to see what we've got going on here. So if I open a ticker, I've got no news. If I open a list, I've got no news. But what should happen is I should be able to add a new item and post it and have it automatically show up in both. Alright, let's see if we solved our other problem. Now, one of the problems is still there, and that's that I never go through and look at my existing list of news items and fill up my ticker with those existing items. But the old problem was that when I added a new news item, it only got added to the new form. It didn't get added to the old form. So let's see what happens here. If I post a news item 2, I've got both 1 and 2 there. I've got my new one here, item 2, and in my existing list form, I've got both. Alright, let's just make sure it also works with another list instance. So I've got 2 instances here of a list type form, and let me post a third news item. Okay, so I'm getting all of my new news items showing up in all instances of my form. So it's a pretty elegant solution. We'll look at the slightly simpler C# implementation in the next video.